The Sutcliffe's house on the Battery was lit up like a ship at anchor. A string quartet worked through something bright near the staircase. Champagne went around on trays held by young men in white gloves. A month ago, a woman told me not to inspect the champagne. Tonight, my daughter was about to show her exactly what a Moretti inspects. I stood near the French doors in my one good blazer, watching Claire cross the room toward a silver tray that wasn't holding champagne flutes at all. About 120 people were in that room. I only had eyes for one of them. In my jacket pocket, I turned over a small rusted rivet between two fingers, the way I have most days since 1981. I've carried this thing in one pocket or another for over 40 years. It's never once been wrong about what's about to give way. But let me back up. A month ago, none of this had a name yet. I just knew my daughter's fiancé had started avoiding my eyes. Welcome to my channel. Get settled, because this one is going to take you somewhere. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to love it here. My name is Frank Moretti. I'm 68 years old. For most of my working life I inspected bridges. The Cooper River spans and every county crossing within 100 miles of Charleston, South Carolina. I'm not telling you that to impress you. I'm telling you because a man's training doesn't retire when he does. I still see load paths in places most people just see a room. I look at a crowded party and count exits the way other men count drinks. The state issued me a card once, laminated, that said I was qualified to determine whether a structure was safe for the public to cross. Nobody's ever issued me a card for people. I've had to work that part out on my own, same as everybody else. Every other Tuesday I drive Claire's old college roommate to her dialysis appointments. No fanfare, no announcement. Every spring I repaint the fence outside the church my wife used to attend, whether anyone asks me to or not. I keep a standing Thursday lunch with 3 of my old crew. 2 of them have hearing aids now, and the whole conversation is mostly shouting across a diner booth. Once, a stranger at that same diner assumed, retired inspector meant buildings, not bridges. I let it go. Correcting a man over lunch has never once struck me as worth his time or mine. I also still, most years, quietly cover the deposit on the church's Easter flowers. It's a tradition Teresa ran for decades and handed to me without much ceremony, the way she handed me most things she trusted me to keep going. Here's one more thing you need to see before we go on. In my jacket pocket, most days, I carry a small rusted rivet. First bridge I ever inspected on my own, back in 1981. A little 2-lane crossing outside Goose Creek that doesn't even carry a name anymore on any map I've seen since. I pulled a rivet that had sheared clean through and put it in my pocket instead of the report folder. I lost that exact rivet somewhere around 1994, if I'm honest. But its replacement has ridden in one pocket or another ever since, and so has the one after that. Whichever one's in my pocket on a given day, it means the same thing it always has. Some things fail quiet, long before they ever fail loud. I sold the business in 2019. Mostly sold it. A man keeps a hand on the rail out of habit, even walking downstairs he's walked 1,000 times. Nobody in my family has ever once asked me exactly what I meant by mostly. I never volunteered a fuller answer, and it never once seemed to matter to any of them. That's the thing about a habit nobody notices. It just sits there, quiet, doing nothing to anybody, until the day it isn't quiet anymore. My wife Teresa passed 5 years ago. Some mornings I still set out 2 coffee cups before I catch myself. It's a small thing. I've stopped being embarrassed by it. Claire is my whole heart. I don't say that kind of thing often, but I'll say it once here, plainly, without embarrassment, because it matters for what comes next. She's 31, a structural engineer at her own firm, and better at the math of it than I ever was. I could feel a bridge was sound before I could always prove it on paper. She proves it on paper first. I've always admired that about her, even when it made her a little harder to argue with at the dinner table. I own exactly one blazer that still fits right, and Charleston in July is not kind to a man wearing it out of obligation. I've worn it to 2 funerals and 1 wedding that wasn't mine, and I was starting to think I'd get one more good use out of it this year. Claire got engaged in the spring, to a young man named Blake Sutcliffe. For about a month, I thought that was the whole story. I was wrong about how much of it I'd actually been told. It was a Thursday, 1 o'clock. An engagement planning lunch at a restaurant on the Battery, with a view of the harbor. Richard Sutcliffe made sure to mention twice before we'd even ordered. Pamela and Richard were hosting. Venue details, guest counts, the usual machinery of a wedding starting to assemble itself. Blake sat across from me, and I noticed he wouldn't quite meet my eyes. He checked his phone twice under the linen, quick, guilty glances, the kind a man gives a screen when he's hoping nobody clocks the habit. I've sat across a lot of tables in my life. Loan officers. Grieving widows. Young engineers convinced their numbers couldn't possibly be wrong. I know the particular stillness of a man who's hiding something long before he ever says a word about it. Claire didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she'd already decided not to make anything of it. She was going through a swatch book of napkin colors with more patience than the subject deserved. She laughed at something Richard said about the mayor's cousin being unable to commit to a seafood tower. I filed the phone checking away. I file most things away. Pamela steered the conversation to what she called logistics, seating charts, who from my side would need special consideration. She said the word side in a tone that made it sound like an apology already halfway issued, before anyone had asked for one. I asked, plainly, whether everything was all right with Blake. He'd seemed distracted for weeks, I said. Nothing accusing in it. A father's ordinary question. Pamela set down her wine glass first. That's the part one remember most clearly, the sound of the glass touching the tablecloth before she spoke. Let's be honest, Frank, she said. Claire is marrying up. Try not to inspect the champagne. I want you to sit with that phrase for a second, marrying up, the way I did, all the way home. Understood, I told her. Frank, Richard started, some half-hearted correction forming, the kind a man offers more for his own comfort than anyone else's. Noted, I said. More tea, please. Claire looked up from her swatch book at that, just for a second, and I gave her nothing to worry about. A small shake of my head. Nothing here, that shake said. Go back to your napkins. The waiter refilled my glass. Nobody at that table said another word about it. The conversation moved on to flowers, to a band Pamela had heard was the only one that matters this season. I let it move on without me. I counted the seams in the tablecloth's pattern instead. An old habit, decades of inspection reports teach a man to count things instead of feeling them, at least until he's alone. I didn't raise my voice. I've never once raised my voice at a woman across a lunch table in my life, and I wasn't about to start over one sentence about champagne. That afternoon, back at my own kitchen table, I did something I do most quarters without much thought. I opened the ownership packet Lowcountry Structural Group still sends me. Nobody in my family knows I still read it line by line, cover to cover, the way a man reads anything he actually built. Most quarters, there's nothing in it worth a second look. Revenue by division, a few project summaries, the kind of numbers that mean more to an accountant than to me. I read them anyway, out of the same habit that has me checking a party's exits. You don't stop watching load pads just because nobody's asked you to. I made myself a pot of coffee I didn't finish and sat down with the packet at the same table where Teresa and I raised Claire. We argued about paint colors at that table. We once spent an entire Sunday there helping Claire rebuild a science fair volcano that collapsed twice before dinner. That table has held a lot of ordinary evenings. This wasn't going to be one of them. I spent 44 years learning that a bridge doesn't fail because of one bad rivet. It fails because 100 small things went unreported, one report at a time, until the day the load finally asks a question the structure can't answer. Sitting at that table, I understood I wasn't looking at one bad lunch. I was looking at 100 small things nobody had reported. And I was the only man at that table still holding a hard hat. I sat with that thought a long while, the packet open in front of me, the house quiet the way it's been quiet for 5 years now. I didn't call Claire that night. I didn't call anybody. I've never once made a decision worth keeping by rushing toward it, and I wasn't about to start over a phrase about champagne either. 2 days later, I went back through that same packet with more attention than I usually give it. That's when I found it. An expense code I didn't recognize, recurring across a handful of entries on a project Blake manages. Hotel Weekends, filed under a client account. I happen to know that account hasn't had an active project running in 8 months. I signed off on its closeout myself, years before Blake ever came to work there. A dormant file doesn't generate Hotel Weekends. Not on its own. If you've ever caught a number that didn't belong in a column you knew by heart, you know the particular kind of quiet that follows. It settles over a kitchen table fast. It isn't panic, not exactly. It's closer to the quiet before a load test, when every gauge in the room is reading normal and you already know one of them is lying to you. I sat with it a long moment. Then I picked up the phone. I called Walt Odom first. Walt's an old friend, a fellow inspector, and my fishing partner for over 30 years now, more Saturdays than either of our late wives ever fully approved of. Teresa used to say she could set a clock by the sound of Walt's truck in the driveway. "You gonna tell me what kind of something?" Walt said when he picked up. "Or are we just gonna sit here and let the fish decide?" "Bring the good rods," I told him. "This might take a while." Walt drove over that same afternoon, tackle box in the truck bed out of pure habit, and never once opened it. I laid out what I'd found at that same kitchen table. The code. The dormant account. Blake's phone, face down under the linen at that lunch. Walt listened the whole way through without interrupting. That's rarer in a friend than most people think, and rarer still in a man who's spent 30 years arguing with me about the right bait for a falling tide. If you've been listening for a while, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. It costs you nothing and it means everything to us. Hit the like button while you're at it, and drop your thoughts in the comments. What Walt was good for that day wasn't advice. It was a name. An old contact of his does title searches for a living, a woman named Doris. She's owed Walt a favor since a fence line dispute back in the 90s, one nobody but the two of them remembers the particulars of anymore. Walt made one call before he left my kitchen. Then a second the next morning, from his own kitchen this time. I'd asked him to use his landline instead of his cell. A neighbor overhearing half a conversation has a way of turning it into a whole story by Sunday. I wasn't ready for this to be anybody's story yet, including mine. Those 2 days, waiting, were their own kind of test. I mowed the lawn twice, which it didn't need. I called Claire once, just to hear her voice. We talked about nothing, the weather, a recipe of Teresa's she was trying to recreate, whether the church fence needed touching up again this spring. I didn't say a word about hotel weekends or dormant accounts. A man doesn't hand his daughter a half-built case. He waits until the joints are load-tested, or he doesn't hand her anything at all. 2 days after that, Walt came back with a name on a lease. A one-bedroom unit out on Daniel Island, signed 8 months earlier, month to month, rent paid automatically from an account that traced, 3 steps removed, straight back to Blake. 8 months, Walt said, quiet, like the number itself was doing most of the talking for him. That's not a mistake, Frank. A mistake doesn't renew itself 8 times running. That's a routine. I sat with that word a while. Routine. A man doesn't build a routine by accident. I called Grace Bellamy the next morning. Grace has run Lowcountry Structural Group's day-to-day operations since I founded the original firm decades ago. She's my oldest colleague in the business. She's also the only person besides Walt who's ever seen me genuinely rattled. That was back during a bridge closure in 2003, a hairline crack nobody else caught in time. It still shows up in my dreams some nights, more than the actual near-miss ever did. Her office looks the same as it always has. Same steel desk, same framed photo of the Ravenel Bridge on opening day, same chipped mug she refuses to replace because it was a gift from her late husband. I sat down across from her the way I've sat down across from her 100 times before. I brought her the billing pattern first, careful to frame it as a routine question. An old owner poking around out of habit, the way old owners do. Grace didn't buy the framing for a second. She's too good at her job for that, and she's known me too long besides. 30-some years of company Christmas parties and change orders and one very long night after the 2003 closure will do that between two people. Frank, she said, setting down her coffee, you still get these quarterly packets. You've held 30% of this company since the day you sold it, and you've never once called me about a line item before 9 in the morning. She waited. Why now? I told her the truth. All of it. The lunch. The champagne line. The phone under the linen. Grace listened the way Walt had, without interrupting, and when I finished she didn't say a word for a long moment either. Grace ran a standard internal expense review at my quiet request. Nothing irregular about it. Her office runs a handful of these a year on any flagged account, quiet and routine, entirely within her authority as managing partner. What came back wasn't a man who'd cut a few corners on dinners he shouldn't have expensed. 16 falsified entries. $11,400, billed to that same dormant client code, spread across exactly the 8 months of the lease. Not a stray charge here and there. A pattern, built the way I'd build a load path, one small member at a time, until it could carry real weight without anybody looking twice. And buried in an email thread Grace flagged almost as an afterthought, she nearly dismissed it as unrelated. There it was. A drafted post-nuptial strategy, built around an 18-month timeline. Time down to the month, to close before Claire's own equity in her engineering firm ever fully vested. 8 months of hotel weekends. 16 falsified entries. One 18-month clock, ticking quietly under a wedding nobody else at that table had thought to question. 3 numbers, and every one of them pointed the same direction. I'd thought, walking out of that restaurant a week earlier, that I was looking at a young man who'd made one bad decision. A coward, too weak to end it cleanly. That's the story I told myself all the way home. I was looking at a family who'd priced my daughter's future down to the month, and decided the wedding could wait exactly as long as the spreadsheet needed it to. I want to be plain about something before I go on. I hired nobody. I threatened nobody. Everything that happened from here forward, I did in the open, with my own name attached to it, the way I've done everything for 40-some years. When I'd first brought Grace the billing pattern, I'd asked her for exactly one thing, that the review run wherever it runs. No instructions. No thumb on the scale. I've inspected enough structures in my life to know the worst thing you can do to an engineer is tell her what answer you're hoping for before she's finished measuring. That's exactly what happened next. The 16 falsified entries and the post-nup draft weren't the end of Grace's review. They were the part that triggered the next step, automatically, the way a clean review does when there's something actually there to find. Blake's P stamp sat on some of the affected project codes. That fact alone triggered a standard referral to the State Engineering Licensing Board. Not because I asked for one. State law requires it once falsified billing touches a stamped project. I didn't write that rule. I just knew it was there, the same way I know a beam's rated capacity whether or not anybody asks me. Here's the part one want you to sit with, because I sat with it a long time myself. I did not tell Claire what I'd found secondhand, over the phone, in pieces. Some men might have, eager to get the worst of it off their own chest first. I waited. I wanted the actual documents in hand before I put any of this in front of her. The lease. The billing file. The post-nup draft. Every page printed and squared into a plain folder. Only then did I drive over, on a Saturday morning, to show her myself, at her own kitchen table. It was the same kind of table Teresa and I once spread report cards and college brochures across, a long time ago. Back then the hardest decisions in Claire's life were about which school to pick, not which family to leave. I told her plainly that the choice from here was entirely hers. I meant it. I didn't inspect a bridge and then tell the county which lane to close. I told her. I gave them the report. They made the call. She read every page without a sound. Not one question, not right away. It was the same quiet, methodical way she's read every report I've ever handed her. That habit goes back to when she was 12 and wanted to know why a bridge she liked had been shut down for repairs. When she finally looked up, she didn't cry, and she didn't rage. She asked me one question. "How long have you known?" I told her the truth, 9 days. She nodded once, the way I nod at a stress reading I'd already suspected. Then she folded the papers back into their folder, with more care than I expected from a woman who'd just learned what I'd learned. Now, while all of that was happening quietly on my end and on Grace's, the Sutcliffes had no idea any of it was in motion. Not the referral, sitting in a licensing office 3 counties over. Not the folder. None of it. Pamela called me that same week, warm as anything, to finalize seating for the engagement party. "Family forward, of course, Frank," she said. "We want you right up front." I thanked her. I confirmed I'd be there. I did not mention that the licensing board referral was already 3 days old by the time she called, sitting quiet in a file somewhere, doing its own kind of ticking. If you've stayed with me this far, you already know where this is headed, and I promise you it gets there. Richard sent a group text a few days later, the same week Grace's review closed and moved to formal referral. Something about the venues. Flawless track record. 3 exclamation points. A photo of the ballroom lit up for evening service. I read it twice at my own kitchen table. Claire's folder still sat closed beside my coffee, waiting for her to be ready to open it a second time, on her own terms, whenever that day came. Sit with that word for a second, flawless, the way I had to. Walt's contact turned up one more detail either of us expected. The Daniel Island lease wasn't just something Blake's parents happened to know about from a distance. Richard Sutcliffe had co-signed it himself, as guarantor. His own name sat right there on the second page, in the same careful hand he'd used to sign 100 contracts before this one. They hadn't just known about the exit plan. They'd financed it, quietly, the way a family funds anything it's decided is worth protecting, no questions asked at the dinner table. Grace found the second twist almost in passing, wrapping up her final notes on the review. The dormant client code Blake had used to bury his charges hadn't seen an active project in 8 months. It had belonged, until then, to a job I signed off on personally, decades before Blake ever came to work there. Same account number. Still sitting open in the system, because nobody had ever thought to formally close it. Blake had hidden his affair inside my own old paperwork without knowing it. A man can build a very careful lie and still not know whose foundation he's actually standing on. 2 named instruments. Too many twists. Not one raised voice from me through any of it. That's not restraint for its own sake, and it never has been. It's just how the work gets done right, whether the load in question is steel or family. I've watched younger men mistake volume for strength their whole careers. A structure that groans loudly under a test load is usually the one that was already fine. It's the quiet ones you have to watch. They give no warning at all, right up until the day they simply stop holding what they were always meant to hold. I've spent my whole life listening for that particular kind of silence. I wasn't about to stop now, over a wedding. The clock, from there, was 4 weeks. The engagement party sat on the calendar like a date circled in somebody else's handwriting. Closing in a little more each morning. I woke up and didn't say anything. Claire told me, quietly, one evening on the phone, that she'd made her decision. She asked me not to say a word to anyone. She wanted to choose the moment herself, on her own terms, in front of the people who'd earned the right to watch her choose it. I agreed without hesitation. It was never mine to take from her, and I'd have been ashamed of myself for trying. So I did what I do best. I showed up exactly as invited, to every remaining planning call over those 4 weeks. The florist. The seating chart. The band Pamela still insisted was the only one that matters this season. I said almost nothing at any of them. I meant every word of the nothing I said. I kept the rivet in my pocket the whole time, turning it over now and then under the table, the way another man might turn over a set of keys. The engagement party was the same Battery mansion, for weeks later, dressed up all over again for a different kind of evening. About 120 guests this time, if I had to count. The mayor's cousin was there, seafood tower secured at last. The same string quartet worked through the same kind of bright, hopeful music near the staircase. Walt came too, at my invitation. In a blazer he complained about the entire drive over. I look like a man testifying at his own hearing, he told me in the car. I told him that was close enough to the truth for one night. Richard rose for the toast a little after 8. Champagne glasses lifted around the room, catching the light off the chandeliers. He was 3 sentences into a story about the families becoming one. Blake stood beside him wearing the kind of smile a man rehearses in a mirror before he trusts it in public. I stood near the French doors, same as I had at the start of this whole story, a month earlier, in the same blazer. The rivet sat in my pocket still, warm from my own hand. Claire stepped forward before the toast finished. She didn't wait for a pause. She didn't raise her voice. She walked up to the same kind of silver tray the champagne had been served from earlier in the evening, and she set her ring down on it, gently. The way you'd set down something you were returning to a store, no anger in the motion at all. Then she said evenly that there would be no wedding. The quartet kept playing for 3 more bars before somebody finally signaled them to stop. In the silence after, I could hear the harbor wind moving through the open doors behind me. Blake's phone lit up on the table in front of him at almost that exact moment. His termination letter, effective Friday, had just landed in his inbox mid-toast. I want to be honest with you about that timing, because it matters. I didn't arrange it. I couldn't have, even if I'd wanted to. It landed exactly when it landed because that's how fast an HR department moves once a licensing board referral goes final, and not 1 hour faster. He looked down at the screen, then up at Claire, then back down again, the way a man checks a gauge twice, hoping the second reading contradicts the first. Pamela's face did something I'd only seen once before in my life, on a homeowner watching an inspector walk toward a crack she'd been told for years wasn't there. First her eyes went to Blake. Then to Richard. Then, last of all, to me. That's when I watched the understanding finally land on her, the kind that arrives all at once, decades too late to do a person any good. Richard set his champagne glass down without drinking from it. Nobody at that party said a word for what felt like a very long time, though I'm sure it wasn't more than 10 or 15 seconds by the clock. 120 people, and not one of them reaching for their phone yet. That would come later, once the shock wore off enough for anybody to think of it. Walt, from his seat near the back, told me later he'd never seen a room go that quiet that fast, not even at a funeral. Funerals, people at least know what to do with their hands, he said. Nobody in that room had the first idea. I noticed 3 things in that stretch of silence, the way I've trained myself to notice 3 things in any room I walk into. Blake hadn't moved an inch, still staring at his phone like it might rearrange itself if he stared hard enough. Pamela's hand had found the back of a chair, gripping it the way a person grips a railing on a boat that's just tipped further than expected. And Claire, beside me, was standing straighter than I'd seen her stand in weeks, the ring already off her finger and out of her life. Claire took my arm. We walked out together through the same French doors I'd been standing near all evening. I'd been watching those doors since the very first page of this story, long before any of you knew what they'd end up meaning. I followed her unhurried. At the door, I stopped just long enough to say 3 things. I said them quietly. I didn't raise my voice for any of them, because I've never needed to raise my voice to be heard by the people who actually matter in a room. She inspects things too, I said. It's the family trade, I said. Lovely party, Pamela, I said. No gloating in any of it. No volume. 3 plain sentences, delivered the way I deliver a finding at the end of a long inspection. Flat. Factual. Final. We walked out into the Charleston evening together, my daughter and me. The quartet was still playing behind us, slightly out of step with itself for the first time all night. It was almost as if even the music had noticed something had shifted in that room. Somewhere behind those doors, 120 people were learning, all at once, exactly what a Moretti actually inspects. If you've made it this far in the story, you already know this was never really about a wedding. It never was. Here's how it actually shook out, in the days and weeks after that party. Blake was terminated from Lowcountry Structural Group effective that Friday, exactly as the letter said. That's roughly $148,000 a year in salary gone, all at once, with nothing lined up behind it. His P license went under formal board review over the 16 falsified entries. That kind of review can take the better part of a year to resolve, and it doesn't often end well for the engineer in question. The Daniel Island lease came apart next. Blake broke it at his own expense, roughly $7,200 in penalties. His co-signing father declined to keep covering the rent on an apartment nobody was hiding anymore. The Sutcliffes forfeit a $30,000 non-refundable deposit on that Battery venue, along with the 2-year vesting scheme that died quietly the same night as the engagement. None of this happened because I raised my hand against anybody. It happened because a licensing board, an HR department, and a landlord all did the ordinary jobs they were always going to do. The paperwork just finally reached the right desks. 31 missed calls, across 4 days, from 3 different Sutcliffe phones. I didn't return a single one that week, and neither did Claire. Walt asked me once, a few days in, if I was tempted to pick up just to hear what they'd say. I told him a man doesn't answer a phone to hear an apology that only exists because he finally got caught. I want to say the numbers plainly, side by side, because that's the only way they mean anything. Blake billed about $11,400 trying to fund a life he thought nobody was checking. Trying to hide that $11,400 ended up costing him $148,000 in yearly salary. A license under review. An apartment he could no longer afford alone. An engagement his own parents had already spent $30,000 trying to guarantee. $11,400 against all of that. He spent it pretending the load was fine. It wasn't fine. It's never fine, once somebody actually checks. The following Saturday, I helped Claire move into a bigger office at the firm. Her own equity, fully intact, nothing about her future contingent on anybody's spreadsheet anymore. We spent the whole afternoon arranging a desk that was, if I'm honest, too big for the boxes she actually had to fill it with. She hung one picture first, before anything else went up on the walls. It was a photo of her and Teresa from a science fair years ago, the volcano project still smoking faintly in the background. Both of them were laughing at something the camera never quite caught. Before I left that evening, I set the rivet down on the corner of her new desk. 40-some years old by then, rusted clean through in one spot, still holding its shape everywhere else that mattered. To remember what holds and what doesn't, I told her. She didn't ask which bridge it came from. She already understood exactly which one I meant. I've learned 2 things in this life that I trust more than almost anything else I know. Load-bearing lies always crack at the joint. You can paint over the joint all you like. The crack doesn't care what color you used. Fresh paint is what rust buys when it's about to be found. I've scraped enough of it off enough bridges, and off enough people now, to know the difference on sight. The rivet's still on Claire's desk, last I checked. She keeps it right next to her monitor, where she can see it. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. I will see you on the next one.